I will say the vast majority of Democrats are pro-law enforcement, and we believe that law enforcement...
He says they're Gestapo.
Let me finish.
He says they're Gestapo.
Scott,
do you agree?
Scott,
do you agree?
Tensions flare. Scott Jennings and Anna Navarro clash over Minneapolis tragedy. A heated debate erupted on CNN's Newsnight as panelists Scott Jennings and Anna Navarro faced off over the recent tragedy in Minneapolis. The exchange on Abby Phillips' show quickly went viral, highlighting the deep ideological divide currently defining American political discourse. Today, we're breaking down the key moments from that panel, analyzing the arguments presented, and discussing the broader implications of this high-stakes confrontation. Let's dive into the footage.
Anna Navarro has joined us at the table. Anna, there were a lot of people who warned that, a massive increase in ICE presence on the ground would inevitably result in American citizens being the victims of some of these encounters.
Yeah, to me this day is very, very somber because I think there were so many indications that this was going to end up happening sooner or later. And it's a day where I think we need to be very sober. And I think, a few things. First, we live in America. We have a right to protest. We have a right to videotape what is happening and amplify the truth. But for the videos that were taken today, we wouldn't know the truth and we wouldn't be seeing it with our own eyes and able to judge it. Also, I think it's negligent that the ICE forces have been increased so quickly and that there's people without the proper training and the proper experience. I don't know if this agent who shot this woman today, I don't know if he's one of the new recruits that got offered $50,000 and maybe has less training and experience than ICE agents regularly do. And that might have been a contributing factor to how this ended up. Maybe if it had been an agent with more experience, the response would have been different. What I do know is that there's a 6-year-old boy who's now orphaned. His father died in 2023, and today his mother got shot to death. And I think it's a time of reflection in America. Protesters need to be peaceful. Protesters have every right to show up and demand accountability. But I also think our government has to be responsible in who they put out in the streets armed and the tone of what's happening with ICE. We've seen some agents really abuse power and almost relish what they are doing. We have seen pregnant women dragged through the streets. We have seen children left alone in cars. We have seen people shot. We have seen people chased like animals. Look, it's a very difficult situation, and we've got to reflect on how we do this so that it doesn't continue happening.
As you mentioned, it did seem to some people that we were headed in this direction because a couple of months ago, there was an incident involving another shooting with ICE agents. They shot into a vehicle and shot a woman. Then they charged her with trying to ram the law enforcement, but those charges were dismissed by a judge in part because of contradictory evidence that contradicted the ICE account of what happened in that incident. And I think all of this, to Anna's point, raises questions, Michael, for me, about this pact that we have between law enforcement and the citizenry, that under normal circumstances, when you get a badge and a gun, it's a huge amount of responsibility. And that responsibility also comes with, you show your face, you're accountable, you report to someone, and you also have, you have rules that you abide by. And that feels like the part that's missing here with ICE, that they've decided ICE agents don't need to show their faces. They don't need to abide by some of the basic principles that regular law enforcement officers do, even though they're engaging with the population at much greater degrees than they used to. Is it a moment to think about that and think about whether that is sustainable?
I'm sure I'm not opposed to having conversations about extended training. Look, if one wants to raise questions about shortening training, if you're going to have agents who don't typically act in law enforcement roles, I would not be opposed to that from my experience with law enforcement broadly speaking. But even with well-trained officers, we have seen instances where officers have to make split decisions. And sometimes it's not nice. We shouldn't jump to conclusions by calling this guy a murderer. We don't know yet. We have no clue.
The ICE accountability crisis. Split-second decisions or systemic negligence. The split-second decision defense is a staple of right-wing rhetoric, but recent footage from the border is challenging that narrative. Obstruction of medical aid. New evidence suggests that the failure to provide care in recent ICE-involved shootings wasn't an oversight, it was a choice. Reports, including those from Fox 9 Minneapolis, indicate that ICE agents actively blocked emergency personnel from reaching a wounded woman. Citizen response. Video shows a bystander identifying as a physician being barred from checking the victim's pulse. Emergency services. An ambulance was reportedly denied access to the scene by federal agents. Legal standards. Unlike standard domestic law enforcement, who are required to allow paramedics to stabilize individuals, these masked agents maintained a perimeter that effectively prioritized tactical control over human life. Rhetoric versus reality. While Ana Navarro has called for calm, rational accountability, the political response has been anything but. Kristi Noem, overseeing these operations, labeled the deceased woman a terrorist shortly after the incident, a calculated statement that moves far beyond the heat of the moment defense. The public sentiment. Despite claims from figures like Scott Jennings that criticizing ICE is an anti-law enforcement stance, the American public remains deeply unsettled. There is a clear distinction between supporting the rule of law and condoning thug-like behavior, where masked agents block life-saving aid. When medical professionals are treated as threats and ambulances are turned away, it is no longer about a split-second reaction. It's about a lack of basic humanity in federal policy.
Difficult to say. Someone has died. I acknowledge that. There's a child who's lost another parent. That doesn't make me comfortable or as a human being at all. But I do believe you have to empower law enforcement officials to do their jobs while assuring that you're also protecting the constitutional rights of citizens. And that's just the way I look at this.
But this looked to me like there was something very wrong because, this ICE officer shot at least 3 times that we could hear on the video with other ICE officers very close to the driver, with people all around the car, with a moving car situation happening, which resulted into that car careening into another car and a tree and could have caused even more death and injuries. So I think we've got to acknowledge all of those things. I saw earlier today the former mayor of Miami-Dade, Carlos Jimenez, who is now a Republican from South Florida, a congressman from South Florida, huge Trump supporter. But when he was mayor of Miami-Dade, and he's also been a fireman for over 20 years. When he was mayor of Miami-Dade, he was the chief executive of the police department. And Jake asked him how he felt about this. And he said, I'm not ready to defend the ICE officer. I have serious questions. And I think we need to take off our partisan hats and we need to look at this with, be very cold-headed, because what we need to work on is make sure to avoid these kind of situations in the future.
Chris Murphy said Democrats cannot vote for a DHS budget that does not restrain the growing lawlessness of this agency. And increasingly, I'm hearing and seeing a lot of Democrats basically saying, back when defund ICE was a position that some liberals were taking and moderates were saying, well, that's gone too far. Now more and more so-called moderates are saying this agency is out of control. When we retake power, we've got to do something about it. Do you think that's the right move?
I think any agency that has this much money behind them needs to have accountability, and it doesn't have that. And I think if there's any question to what Shermichael's making and what Anna is saying, this idea of like, we don't really know what happened, we don't know what the officer was thinking in this moment, it might come down to training, it might not come down to training, it looks like this, it looks like that. At the end of the day, she was pulled out of the car and she was not dead yet. And a doctor was on the scene and tried to help her, and the ICE officer said, get away from her or we'll shoot you. So they shot a woman and then threatened to shoot a man who was trying to help the woman. So if you're telling me that this was just a split-second decision, she might have been saved. But her wife had to watch her bleed out on the ground while a doctor stood by with an ICE officer with a gun in his face. So I don't know what we're talking here.
In that aftermath.
Well, they've spoken to the doctor.
Right, no, yeah, and I think my point is that what transpired after she was shot, did they render aid? Did they allow aid to be rendered to her? Again, this is all part of the picture that Americans are seeing, and they're asking, what's going on here?
Well, they're all fair questions and should all be part of a legitimate investigation. I think that's what the American people would expect. I mean, a lot of people witnessed this. There have been a lot of witnesses on television today. We played some. I saw another interview with another witness who said that this lady in the van was the leader of a convoy that was attempting to impede and obstruct the road where legitimate law enforcement operations were taking place. I would also like to know if that is true, because that's what an eyewitness has said. If that is true, I think one of the questions we have to ask is, why are people believing that it is okay to create vehicle convoys for the purpose of impeding federal law enforcement? My suspicion is it's because they've been told by politicians that it is their responsibility to do so. It is in fact a felony to obstruct federal law enforcement activities. If you don't like the immigration laws, that's a legitimate position, but you don't change laws by creating convoys to obstruct law enforcement officers. You call the politicians and ask them to change the laws. Political vigilantism is getting people killed. This lady should not be dead. I hate it that she is dead, because this poor kid, as Anna said, is an orphan. I don't love in any way, shape, or form that someone is dead, but we have to ask ourselves hard questions about why people are putting themselves in these positions, and we've seen it all over the country.
Because they're Americans and they can't stand what they are seeing. I don't think
Does that mean you can impede a law enforcement officer?
No, but that wasn't the case on January 6th either, and they were pardoned. And just this week, they were marching down the street to the Capitol again. Why are you shaking your head?
Because this cannot be your go-to.
But no, I'm not saying that.
On January 6th,
I am pro-law enforcement.
Democrats said we're pro-law enforcement. Today they say they're Gestapo. Which is it? Which is it?
No, I will say the vast majority of Democrats.
The breakdown, accountability, or disingenuous narrative. Questions are mounting over a recent ICE operation that took a tragic turn. While some commentators, like Scott Jennings, argue these agents were simply performing lawful duties, the facts on the ground tell a much more complicated story. The facts versus the rhetoric. We still lack a full accounting of why ICE was on that specific street, but the consequences are undeniable. Mistaken identity. Reports indicate that several individuals detained during the sweep were, in fact, American citizens. A fatal error. Most significantly, the woman killed during the encounter was not an illegal alien, as some narratives imply, but a US citizen. Why the comparison fails? There is a growing effort to equate this incident with the Capitol Police response to the January 6th insurrection. However, journalists and legal experts point out a massive distinction. One was a direct response to a violent riot. The other was an ambiguous street operation involving residents with legal standing. To suggest these scenarios are the same isn't just a stretch, it's disingenuous. While Scott Jennings continues to push this framing, the public is left wondering, when did lawful duty become a catch-all excuse for fatal errors against American citizens?
Pro-law enforcement, and we believe that law enforcement.
He says they're Gestapo.
Let me finish.
He says they're Gestapo.
Scott,
do you agree?
Scott,
do you
let
agree?
me finish. I do not agree. Let me finish. Many Democrats, and the vast majority of them, are pro-law enforcement. They believe that law enforcement should actually get the training that they deserve and they need. Hold on, I'm not done. Hold on.
You don't know about this guy's training.
Let me tell you.
Stop implying that he's not training.
In Minnesota,
he was dragged by a car last summer.
In Minnesota, blocks from where this woman was killed was the George Floyd shooting. What happened at the time is the Justice Department entered a consent decree with the Minneapolis Police Department wanting to provide those law enforcement officers training so something like that would never happen again. And Donald Trump's administration completely dismissed that matter. And so now Minneapolis law enforcement officials are not getting the training that they need. Democratic Party is pro-law enforcement. They were pro-law enforcement on January 6th. They didn't issue those pardons.
They call them the Gestapo, Sochi.
They're pro-law
they call them murderers.
Now,
they call them Nazis.
But why is it one rule for ICE and why is it another rule for the Capitol Police or the Republican Party? Can you answer that question?
I have the same rule for all law enforcement. I think we should respect all law enforcement.
Has two rules.
You all have one day a year. One day a year you like the cops.
Well, look,
the other 364 days you call them the Gestapo. That's the Democratic position.
The myth of the anti-police Democrats. Analysis. The narrative versus the reality. Scott Jennings recently claimed that Democrats only support law enforcement one day a year. It's a bold claim, but is it backed by facts? The reality is far more nuanced. There is a massive distinction between being anti-police and being pro-accountability. The pushback isn't against law enforcement stopping crime. It's against police brutality, the shooting of unarmed citizens, and lack of oversight in agencies like ICE. The ICE controversy, accountability or propaganda? The recent tragedy involving an ICE shooting has reignited this debate. While Ana Navarro offered a measured take, emphasizing that even MAGA supporters are questioning the lack of transparency, Jennings and others like Kristi Noem immediately pivoted to labels, calling the victim a terrorist before the facts were even in. This raises a critical question. Is this administration interested in truth-telling? Or is it about protecting a narrative at all costs? Why professionalism matters. Unlike local police departments, we are seeing reports of masked agents blocking medical aid and avoiding identification. This isn't standard law enforcement. It's a lack of oversight that should concern every citizen, regardless of party lines. Your take, is demanding accountability the same as being anti-police? Or is Scott Jennings right that the rhetoric has gone too far? Does ICE need more oversight? Should agents be allowed to mask their identities during domestic operations? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your perspective on where the line should be drawn. Don't forget to give me like and subscribe for more analysis. I'm Insights Brief. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.